you very much. It's really good to be with you. And I'm passionate about safeguarding, and so I really want to talk about how safeguarding is something we all care about, all of our responsibility, and something that we can all be part of developing a good and a healthy culture around for our churches, where we keep people safe and we keep ourselves safe too. A little bit of my background. I'm the bishop with responsibility on behalf of Bishop Sarah in the Diocese of London for working with our safeguarding colleagues, and that's covering the whole of London Diocese, and I'm quite new to it, so there's been a lot to learn. Previously I was an archdeacon, so I've had my fair share, probably more than my fair share, of difficult clergy misconduct and difficult safeguarding situations that have really captured a whole parish for a time and really needed some quite careful working through. I do want to say, though, that I'm not a police or a social work trained safeguarding professional. It's really important that you know that. I'm a clergy person that really cares about safeguarding and wants us all to do it better in church and in community. So I hope you'll take what I say, which is from experience, from working things through. It's stuff that I've been trying to learn and get better at on the way. I also want to say that I'm aware that conversations about safeguarding can sometimes be unsettling, disturbing, upsetting. And if you need to take some time out during the session to turn your camera off, to put yourself on mute, even to leave the Zoom room and come back again if you need to, then that's completely fine. And if this raises some things for you that you feel you want to talk to somebody about afterwards, a professional, then I would really encourage you to do that through your diocesan safeguarding advisor. They'll be able to hear you in a professional way, in a way that we can't this evening. But it's really important, if this stirs something up for you that you're not sure about, that you do go and ask for some help. I also want to say there's so much we're not going to cover. I feel like I'm going to let you down. I'm almost certain to let you down. Safeguarding is a really big topic, and so is well-being. And I'll chart a path through it that I hope gives us a bit of theological reflection, time for some questions, a bit of a case study, talking about ministry, ordained and other ministry and the responsibilities of that. But there's tons of stuff that I'm not going to cover. Even just today, we've been in conversations in our diocese about, what's the intersection between safeguarding and racial justice work? What's the intersection between safeguarding and working with people who are LGBTQI+? There's a whole range of topics that we won't cover that need much further thought and reflection by the whole church. So my apologies for what I don't do, but I'll try and chart a way through. If you're able to share my PowerPoint slide, I have got a little bit of a kind of roadmap, so you know where we're going. And I promise that there will be time for a coffee break in the middle of that as well. And I'm just going to exit that so I can actually see my notes, but I hope you can all see it. There we go. And so if I could have the second slide. This is what we're going to cover. If you look at slide 2, outline, there'll be some input from me. There'll be some small group conversations. There'll be some individual reflection time, which I won't ask you to share. I'll make sure that that's done safely, that you can write down your own thoughts, keep them to yourselves, and also time for questions and for comment. And we're roughly going to cover these 5 areas. As I said before, a bit of theological reflection, a bit of stuff about human behaviour, conduct, boundaries, and understanding the background of what's there around policy, all of which you could go follow up afterwards if you'd like to know more. So that's the rough shape of the evening, and I'll aim for a coffee break after our case study and before the questions and answers, so you can think about what you'd really like to ask. If I could have slide 3, this is really what I think we need to be talking about. So when we're talking about well-being and safeguarding, we need to talk about what healthy ministry looks like, lay and ordained, shared by the whole people of God in community, holding each other to account. We need to talk about healthy boundaries that keep ourselves and other people safe. We need to talk about good collaboration and accountability. None of us should be a one-man or a one-woman band. We need each other to be held to account, to be safe, and to do things better than we've managed in the past. We also need to notice and talk about what's difficult. My sense is that the Church of England finds that really hard. But actually, by shining a light into the darkest corners of our churches and of the world, we might become healthier. We might be be further towards becoming the people God has called us to be. So we need to notice and talk about what's difficult. We also need to notice and tackle what's wrong. And that doesn't mean sweeping things under the carpet. It means proper, safe, accountable processes for holding each other to account and saying, this is not okay, and this stops here. We also, I think, really need to talk about this because it's the gospel. We need to care about living the gospel in word and action. It's no use being a church that preaches all sorts of things about caring for the vulnerable if in our churches we don't help keep each other safe. So this matters not because it's a kind of tick box exercise, but because it's the gospel. And it's about wanting our lives to be consistent, to be consonant with what we preach. And all of this is all of our responsibility. And it sounds idealistic. It's, is this utopia? Will we see this side of heaven? Well, yes, it's hard, but we really have to hold on to what the gospel's about and what the highest standards of professional conduct look like in our own age. And always that involves starting with ourselves, our own behaviour, and then going on to think about the quality of our shared life in families and in communities. So that really, for me, is what we need to be talking about tonight in our PCCs, in our deaneries, in our synods, across the church. This is about the foundations of healthy culture, talking about all of these things. Now, to do that, we have some key kind of policy documents that are aimed at keeping us safe. So if I could have slide 4, they'll give us a little bit of again, a pathway of documents that keep us on the right track. Now, I'm not going to talk us through policy documents in detail, or else you'll all be asleep before you've even got to your hot cocoa and put your slippers on. These are here to refer to, and there's the Parish Safeguarding Handbook, policy about safer environment and activities, code of safer working practice. And if you go and look on the Church of England's main safeguarding pages, they're all there, and so much more as well. It's really important, this stuff, that we go back and we refer to it, and that we don't just let it sit on our shelves, but that we understand how this keeps us on track. The other thing as well, if I could have the next slide, slide 5, is about the guidelines for the professional conduct of the clergy. Now, I'm not just talking about clergy this evening, but these are a really useful place to start, because they give us some pointers towards the particular temptations and opportunities available to those in ministry, and maybe especially clergy. And so we will spend some time this evening talking about the behaviour of those in ordained ministry. They're not our only safeguarding issues, obviously, but clergy have an important role in leadership and in culture setting. Clergy also have an important place in the public imagination. A lot is projected onto clergy. And so we will be looking at this in a little bit more detail in our case study. If we could have slide 6 as well, please. This gives a reminder from the archbishops. Again, written to clergy, but applicable to anybody who holds a position in ministry, who understands the responsibility of the trust that's placed in them, whether you're an organist or a church warden, a youth minister, or a clergy person. There are particularly high standards expected of you because you represent the church more widely. And this reminder from the archbishops to clergy is true way beyond clergy. This is about representing the faith that we share and behaving in such a way that enables others to behave and to act safely as well. So this is about trust, and it's about how we're a system, we're organised together with leadership and governance and culture holding us together. And these are the things that underpin everybody's well-being and everybody's responsibility. These guidelines, these policies give boundaries to our behaviour. They remind us to think about how our behaviour might come across to other people, even if we don't intend it. They also help us to notice behaviour that could have become normalised in our context, but could be harmful. So please read these, follow the web pages, get them down off your bookshelves, and come back to these really important points. This is about people, especially the most vulnerable. It's about recognizing that churches have not always been as safe as they should have been. This is not some new equivalent of health and safety gone mad. This is a biblical imperative to care for those who are most vulnerable. And also, this is about a moment of reckoning for the Church of England. You'll be aware of the past cases review too, that's coming to a conclusion at the moment. You'll probably be aware of ICSA, the independent inquiry. We're going through a time of dusting off the old files and bringing things to light that should have seen the light many years ago. This is about holding ourselves to account, and it's a time of reckoning. And one of the things I've come to realise is that the story at the moment isn't even so much about abuse, but it's about the cover-up of abuse. And it's about the church's failure to reckon with what can go wrong, what has gone wrong. And it's sometimes been about that being covered up as well. So dust off those policies, read those guidelines, and remember they're about the heart of the gospel, about caring for people. If we could move on to slide 7, and in a little while there will be a chance for you to do some conversation so you can start to unpack what these things look like, what a healthy church looks like. I just want to say a bit as well about the connection between safeguarding and other areas that we need to reflect on as a church, and in particular to talk about sexuality and intimacy and spirituality and humanity. These are all really important parts of our identity. Of course, not all safeguarding matters are about sex, though many are. Quite a lot are also about money. I think all of them are also about power. But as a background to all safeguarding and conduct matters should be an understanding that sexuality and intimacy and spirituality and power dynamics in human relationships are all part of being human. Now, in church, we can find it really difficult to talk about any or all of these, or the connections between various of these. I think we're not great about talking about money either, to be honest, probably for some quite similar reasons that go into deep things about identity and status within us. But to come back to the question of sexuality, it's not in itself sinful to be a sexual being. However we read Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve, we must see that although there are parts of our human relating that can lead us to dishonour God and each other, there's also a goodness to creation as made by God that God can delight in. So sexuality isn't a part of our lives to be hidden away from God or to feel shame about. But the conversation that we need to have with God and with ourselves and in appropriate contexts with each other is about how we use those gifts of sexuality and intimacy and spirituality, and how these are all bound up with being human. We're aware that sexuality, like money, can very often be the source of very wicked behaviour, but there are also ways that both can be used with thankfulness for good and for deepening in good ways our human relationships. I'm not going to go into detail about those things this evening, but I really want to recommend to you the Living in Love and Faith materials, because I think that they offer really wise and profound starting points for good conversations about all of these issues, and also the pastoral principles that are listed there if you follow that link, which are about power dynamics really in our relationships and in our conversations. So they're about having a better conversation than we've been able to have previously. Not being able to talk well about identity and power, which includes sexuality and spirituality, is really deeply damaging. Shame eats people up and it doesn't make them behave better. So a plea really in your own contexts, in thinking about safeguarding and about your own well-being, is to work at having healthy conversations about who we are individually, in relationship and in community, and work from there to think about keeping each other safe, with a particular emphasis on those who at any point might be vulnerable. If we could have slide 8, this is going to give us a bit of a little activity that we'll do in breakout rooms just to get the conversation going, because you don't want to listen to me for the whole evening just talking. I'd like you to, if you would, to reflect with each other in a small group about what a healthy church looks like. I think we know one when we see one, we feel it, we experience it, we love it when it's healthy. But it's quite difficult sometimes to put your finger on what makes a church healthy. There are some churches I go to that I think, I wish I could bottle what you've got and share it around the Church of England, because there's a kind of openness and frankness and care that really speaks of God. But you'll know what your own experiences are of what a healthy church looks like. And so for 10 minutes in your groups that you'll be put into in just a moment, I'd like you to invite you to have that conversation and maybe jot down 1 or 2 things for yourself, if you've got a paper and a pen in front of you, that you think are the most important features. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you to type those into the chat and then wait a moment, not press enter until everyone else is done. And we can see the whole range of what people have experienced as being a healthy church. So that's how we'll do the feedback. But if you would then, as we go into breakout groups now for 10 minutes, would you talk that through? Give examples of what it really looks like to be a healthy church and see what we come up with. And let's look at the spread and where they kind of coalesce. So 10 minutes, we'll be back by about 8 o'clock. My question is that 5 marks of a healthy church might also be really great to have, or more than 5. So in a moment, if you could just go into the chat function. Now, if you can restrain yourselves, don't hit enter at the end, because otherwise it doesn't matter if you have already, that's not a problem at all. But then people start to think, oh, I ought to say that. And then they start saying what everyone else has said and we get groupthink. So you want to type in what you think are one of the marks of a healthy church. And if you're a speedy typer, in a minute you can put another one in as well. But just remember, if you hit that return button, it will show it to everybody else. So I'm going to count to 10 in my head, and then I'm going to say, hit the return button. And at that point, we'll all be able to see in the chat what everyone else has put, and I'll try and pick out some themes from that. So would you hit return if you're finished typing? And let's just take a moment to listen to what everyone, I'll read and listen to what everyone has written in there. Lots of interesting thoughts coming up. If you've got a second one, feel free to put a second one in if you can type fast enough. And there are some themes coming up there that you recognise across your different experiences about integrity, about good communication, about sharing information, honesty, collective responsibility, about people being valued and having a voice, being welcomed, but also being aware that even those people we trust and love might be capable of hurting each other. So looking beyond what's obvious. Safeguarding training, yeah, there's a great one. That we accept training and that we're open to learning. We know that we don't know everything. Incredibly important that we've got a kind of learning mindset. My children would tell me that's what they're always being told at school, is a learning mindset where you're open to knowing what you don't know. Sometimes the hardest thing of all. So really interesting thoughts there coming up. And we're going to pick up some of those in the rest of the evening, because safeguarding and well-being have a kind of individual aspect to them. We all need to think about our own behaviour, but we also need to think about how we are together as a community, and what we notice about each other, what we tackle, that we don't get groupthink. So I didn't get you to all hit return immediately, so that we've got some independence and we can challenge each other. And so we will pick up some of those themes in the case study that I'm going to move on to before too long. But thank you for that. And what we'll try and do is capture some of those so that they can be circulated afterwards as, you know, some really important marks of a healthy church that you know from your own learning and experience. And they could be there for further reflection for you afterwards. You could even take them back to your deanery or to your PCC and say, do we want to discuss these, refine them even further? What does this look like in my context? What does good communication look like for my church? So I encourage you to keep this learning, keep this thinking going, because we know what it looks like, but we've also got to be open to learning a bit more about what would be good. So if I could have the slides back, and we're on slide 9, that would be really helpful at this point. Thank you. So if you go to slide 9, we've got a Wordle. I like my Wordles. Now, this is a bit of a heavy set of words, but let me give you a bit of background to where they come from. And my aim isn't to shock, but it is to help us be alert to what can be wrong and sometimes hiding in plain sight. I think that's a phrase that we've all become aware of because of the Jimmy Savile inquiry, just how things can hide in plain sight. And it maybe has been easy in the past to think that things don't happen in churches because we want to think we're good people, we want to think the best of others. But from my own experience, I've been ordained since 2000, so that's nearly 22 years. As a curate and a vicar, and I've worked in a cathedral, and I've been an archdeacon, and now in Stepney as a bishop. There's been a whole range of bad behaviour that I've seen over that time, from theological college to now. So just some examples: benefit fraud, casual sex with strangers, domestic violence towards a spouse and children, theft, unprofessional behaviour towards colleagues, lying, adultery, abuse of power, sexual behaviour with a teenage girl, a schoolgirl, failures of financial governance, child sexual abuse, unauthorised and dangerous work to church buildings involving electrics not done properly. It's been quite eye-opening, really, over that time. And I've got well beyond the possibility of thinking it doesn't happen in church. I think I've got to the point where I look for what might be wrong. And that doesn't mean I can't trust or love people, because there are some wonderful people in our churches. But I think I'm aware that the church is really no different from the wider world. We are fallen human beings and we can get things wrong. And there can be people who are very mixed with many good qualities, but who are also capable of real harm. And there are also just sometimes very, very wicked people who are manipulative and very good at covering their tracks, and who are able to hide in plain sight, and who sometimes realize that churches can be great fields of opportunity for their behaviour. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study. I'm not going to name where it was, though actually it's important you know that some of the biggest church cases are available. If they've been to a tribunal, you can read about them, and by looking on the Church of England pages. And it's important that we're open and transparent about what's gone wrong and what can be learned from it. But I'm just aware that the situation I'm talking about is a real parish where people are trying to recover and get on with their lives and love each other and come to kind of healing. And I know they're doing an amazing job of that, and I really applaud them. But this has been a really significant point of learning for me. And so I want to share a bit of it with you. And then from that, I want to draw out some general points about what can a whole church be learning about its behaviour as a community, as a congregation. And then what are some of the bigger points of learning for churches more generally, for the whole Church of England, as we think about safeguarding and about well-being and about conduct of anybody in ministry, whether ordained ministry or other positions of responsibility. So the case I'm thinking of actually goes back lots of years. The first issues that happened took place in the 1990s, but they weren't reported to the police until 2015. and they concerned the abuse of a child. Her age was disputed, and that's why in the end it didn't go to criminal proceedings. But what happened took place around the 16th birthday of this particular child. And that case, when it came up, led to the vicar, who was then working in a different diocese, being prohibited from ministry for 5 years. And of course, that meant losing his job in the parish where he then worked. For me, the learning in this case was about how difficult it was for a whole community to come to terms with what had happened. And I should say, as background, the Church's own processes for dealing with clergy discipline and with matters of misconduct are not great. They're not speedy, they're not obvious, they're quite opaque, and parts of them are rightly confidential, but it's very difficult to keep communication with parishes in a way that helps the parish to get on side and understand what's going on. And what was really experienced in that parish was a kind of fury towards the diocese, because a lot of people really didn't believe that their vicar could possibly have done what he was accused of. There was a lot of blaming language towards the person who'd made the accusations, who, of course, they didn't know her identity, but they knew that there was a person who'd made a complaint. There was a lot of minimising of the behaviour that he'd engaged in. I won't give you the details of what he'd done and the kind of sexual behaviour that was involved, because I don't think it needs to be talked about, but minimising it to make it out to be something that she'd asked for, or that was just kind of not that serious anyway, was one of the things that happened. And it led to huge opposition between that parish and the bishop at the time, including people walking out of a service where the bishop told them what was happening. And not everybody thought like this. There were people who perhaps had a background in health or education who were more understanding of the process, though many were baffled by the Church of England's odd processes and the time it took for the police to investigate, never mind the Church of England. There were also some amazing people who led the parish through that time, lay people, great church wardens, a great associate priest, who really kept the care of souls, the cure of souls during that time. Even when the vicar was still living in their midst, was setting up alternative services, was setting himself up as an independent funeral celebrant so that he could do services nearby. It was a really extraordinarily difficult time. A further complaint then came to light, and that is a case that actually went to a tribunal, because it involved an abuse of pastoral ministry more recently within that parish himself. And in the end, the person was prohibited from ministry for life. Now, if we could move on to slide 10, I hope you'll be able to see why I've told you this case, which it is distressing and distasteful, and I do recognise that it's quite hard to hear. But it has got some really important, bigger pieces of learning for me about how congregations, how clergy, how those in ministry behave together, and how we kind of run ourselves as a church. The first point that you'll see there on the slides is about personal and pastoral boundaries. The particular trust that's placed in those in ministry, lay and ordained, but recognised ministry, is huge. And to break those boundaries, to step beyond pastoral listening and care into something that's physical, sexual, is entirely inappropriate, even if it's consensual, because a trust has been broken, and because clergy in particular hold a wider representative role. It represents a wider betrayal, and it's really important that that's noted, and that we talk about what pastoral boundaries look like as we care for each other, whether that's people involved in counselling or ministry or medics or social workers. Boundaries really matter. The second point is just how difficult some of those processes are. The police can take a long time to work things through. The church can take a long time too. There are questions about what's proof. There are also distinctions to be made between what might be illegal and what might not, and yet might still be what we call conduct unbecoming, so not appropriate behaviour for somebody who is in a position of recognised ministry, including clergy. And we're not very good at explaining that. I hear criticisms now, sometimes like, well, it was nothing illegal, what's the church, why are we bothered? But it matters because of the trust that we hold in ministry when we work with people, when they trust us with their their deepest concerns, their matters of faith, the matters of life and death that we all live through. So it's important that we talk about what it is that we mean, and understand that proof is difficult because this is private and often quite hidden to other people. The third thing I think that it brings out for me is about how whole congregations and communities can be groomed. Now, grooming as a word is something I think that we recognise it's come into greater use more recently, and it's about priming people to be accepting of abusive behaviour, whether that's physical or sexual or psychological or spiritual. It's about sometimes people with a huge amount of charisma who speak fluently and ably and convincingly, people who are personable, people who are powerful, people who we want to love us and who we maybe love in return. And that isn't just something that happens to individuals. It can happen to whole congregations or even villages, communities, where there becomes a collective view that this is a good person who shouldn't be challenged. And it's very difficult to step outside of that if you're someone who sees it differently. And yet it's also really important to take on that role of being a sentinel, a truth speaker, speaking truth to power, and recognising that uncritical, unthinking adulation of a leader is actually what you see in a cult. It's not something that is necessary for us to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. And for clergy too, to recognise if they're falling into the trap of longing for that admiration and adulation, to be adored by people, to be treated like the Messiah when none of us is. And so important to name that we can all be groomed, and that can include groups of people, not just individuals. My other point of learning was around forgiveness. Now, we're in the forgiveness business, right? That's what we do. And we're not about holding grudges. There is the possibility of restoration and healing. And it's really important we don't lose sight of that and just condemn people to, outer darkness because they've done something wrong. However, to forgive people is not the same as saying that they should be able to continue to be in an unsafe position where they might hurt people. And giving people opportunities to hurt others is not acting in a forgiving way. It's not a Christian or a loving thing to do. So yes, forgiveness, but with boundaries that mean that hurt can't continue. There's also a question of how open we're able to be and to talk about these things when they've gone wrong. Many people would prefer things to be just dealt with quietly. I've worked with colleagues who were just moved on to another parish. Though in the case I'm thinking of from when I was a curate, that just meant that the wife and children were subject to further abuse because nobody knew them because they'd been moved. That is how things were done in the old days. I think it probably sometimes still happens now. But openness is really important, that we face and work through what's gone wrong. At the same time, though, not everything can be shared. There's a difference between secret and private. Some things are private because they're about people's lives, or because they're allegations that need time to be worked through and tested. And so it's important to be open. It's important to be appropriately private, but not secret. And it's important to be able to say honestly where things have gone wrong. And that involves engaging with the media who are interested, not being defensive, and admitting where we've got learning still to do, where we might have gone wrong. In the case study I'm talking about, it was actually some media engagement that led to the second allegation coming to light. I had a phone call that I will never forget that came off the back of a TV interview where somebody said, "I need to talk to you." It's really important that we can be open so that more can come to light. It's important that we talk to each other about seeing beyond charisma. And we're suckers for charisma sometimes in the church. We like a really great charismatic leader. And we love someone who can grow the church, and we love churches that can pay plenty of common fund, parish share, whatever you call it. And sometimes those people are quite difficult to challenge. I'm not suggesting for a moment that they're the only people who misbehave. There are people who misbehave across lay and ordained ministry in all sorts of different traditions of church, in large and small churches, rural and urban, of every different setting. but it's very hard to challenge people who are powerful. That's the point I want to make. And so being able to see beyond charisma is hugely important. You know, the same rules for everybody, however successful their ministry. We could go on to the next slide. I'd like to draw out some, I suppose, wider points for the learning of the whole church that we might be willing to think about as we train people in lay and ordained ministry, as we look at safeguarding policies, we look at safeguarding training. I've put those on here again for your own reflection, and I'll just talk us briefly through them before we then head for a quick coffee break. The first point I want to really draw out, and this brings us back to the well-being theme that is running alongside our safeguarding theme, is to guard each other. So whatever position we hold, however powerful we are, nobody is above safeguarding, and everybody needs to attend to their well-being. I'm forever conscious of this, more conscious than I've ever been as a bishop, because people are just so nice to me. They're so generous, they flatter, they're kind, they say really nice things about my sermons, and it's really bad for me. And when I come home on a Sunday after a really lovely big confirmation service where everyone's been really jolly, I walk into my house and I'm so grateful that my husband and kids say, here's a potato peeler, come on, crack on, there's some carrots to do, and the potatoes are just going in. It's important to be ordinary, and that we all have people who will bring us back down to earth and say, as my kids will say to me, will you stop being bishopy, please? And can we just be ordinary? So the more power we have, the more vulnerable we can be to temptation, and the greater the opportunity to do harm. My college principal said to us all as we were about to leave, whatever your weakness, ordained ministry will find you out. And those are quite sobering words, and not just for ordained ministry, but for anything that has a public profile, a platform, an opportunity. Whatever your weakness, those opportunities will find you out. I want to hold on to that, but we need to hold on to it for each other and draw each other back to being accountable. The second thing that I've spent quite a lot of time reflecting on, particularly, I think this is the more I have to do with cathedrals, to be really honest, is to be really alert to the overlaps between sexuality and spirituality, and to look at how worship and music and prayer and pastoral counselling can all kind of interact with that. In some settings of faith, there can be real heightened emotion. There's also real closeness and genuine vulnerability. These can be really good things, but done without boundaries and not set up carefully, they're breeding grounds for bad behaviour. And so I was really pleased when my son came home from church and said, oh, we had a time of kind of healing prayer where people could go and be prayed for. And he said it was really carefully done. And we were reminded of the importance of being open and transparent and visible, and for the leadership team to make sure that they were accountable to others, that no one is heading off into dark corners for heightened moments of prayer where the wrong steps are taken. And I'm glad that we're more attentive to that. We need to be accountable. We need to avoid being alone in unsafe settings. We need to be alert to the opportunities for manipulation in private prayer, in confession, in conversations that are about deep and vulnerable matters. We need supervision if we're in those kind of positions with people who are telling us stuff that's deep, because that keeps us accountable. The third area of reflection is about too many messiahs. You know, are we saving people, or is God? God is saving people, not us. And it's so important to be aware of the rescuer or persecutor or victim dynamics. In a moment, when we have the coffee break, I'll pop into the chat a little reference to Cartman's drama triangle, and it tells us a little bit about how we sometimes fall into those roles of being somebody's rescuer, or becoming a victim, or even persecuting them, and how we might move into a kind of healthier way of being in different roles. It's really important reading for people involved in pastoral ministry. But the basic message is keep a check on that Messiah complex. I think most of us have got one, and it needs really firmly putting back in its box. There's only one Messiah, and it's not me and it's not you. Fourth thing is about role and status. particularly true of clergy, but not only, youth workers, directors of ministry, church wardens, people who have status. I think there's a particular thing for clergy about the public expectations that may be put on them and perhaps their families if they're living in the same household. Clergy are very dependent on stipend and on housing. They're not very often held to account. I sometimes make the comparison with the failure of single GP practices, the Harold Shipman case being the best example. Who is watching over and noticing sole practitioners? Who can tell if they're drifting into trouble? But then also, if those people themselves knew that they were going wrong, who would they tell? Did they have supervision, counselling, peer support, reflective practice? Could they tell their archdeacon before they did something wrong, rather than it being found out afterwards? And I think that's a real challenge for archdeacons, who often sit on both sides of that care and support role, but also maybe a disciplinary role. How is that arranged in a diocese? Who could the person talk to before they really went badly wrong? I've also already mentioned, so I won't say too much more about this, but that whole congregations can be groomed by clergy, by directors of music, by lay leaders, by youth workers. And congregations can be very hostile to truth tellers in their midst. So, blessed are the truth tellers, for they shall not be groomed, though they may be cast out. That's worth remembering. And then a final point before coffee. This is everyone's responsibility. We are fostering, I hope, a culture of whole church safeguarding, where we're attentive to and where we notice and reflect on the power dynamics that we all have. I'm going to pause there. It's been a lot of me talking around the case and the learning from it. I hope that as we have a little tea, coffee break, some of that might percolate, if you'll excuse the pun, into your own thinking about your own practice. But when we come back, there's a little bit of time for some questions and answers. And then just a brief reflection on a little passage from Colossians about our own being and our own practice, and about the need for the renewal of that, so that we keep firmly turning to God. So can we be back by 25 to 9? So that's a 9-minute coffee break, tea break, cold water break, biscuit break, hot chocolate, Horlicks, whatever your tipple is at this time of night. We'll see you back at 25 to 9. Bring a mug if you need to. We could go on all evening with the questions, because there's a really rich area that we're all grappling with. And there's, I want to encourage you to think we're always learning. We're never going to be able to say, right, we've cracked this. We've got safeguarding in the Church of England. This is a perpetual learning. And I'm going to come on to that in a moment as we think about Colossians and about being renewed. So if I could, please, could I have slides 13 and then 14? And this is a passage from Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 to 16, and it's just divided across 2 slides. I'm not going to read it all out, because I think that will take up a lot of time, but you might want to come back to it in your own reflections. And I'm just going to hope that our wonderful slide master there will sort of choose a moment to switch from 13 to 14 so that you can reflect on it. If you don't find what I'm saying helpful, that's fine. Just read the text, because God will speak to you, I'm sure, whatever I try to say. But the reason really I've chosen this passage is because it's got some quite tough words in it. And St. Paul is being really clear that fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed of different kinds need to be put to death. It's a reminder for me that we're all capable of entertaining desires and acting in ways that can be harmful to other people. So I think it's right that we hear these words and that we don't soften them. And it's also right that institutions, including the whole Church of England, our own churches, our own deaneries, and our own communities, where we know we've not always been as honest as we could have been about facing up to abuse, that we really hear these words, that we really take them to heart. And yes, you can have copies of all of these slides, so there's plenty of opportunity for you to go away and really reflect on them yourselves. And given some of what we've been talking about imbalances of power, abuses of power across the range of different kinds of abuse, I think it's important that we spend time and let these words dwell in us, and then reflect about, as a church, how we might do better at investigating, acknowledging, making reparation for boundaries being broken, and trying to live a different culture of transparency and accountability and proper care and support for those who've been hurt. The Christian life involves forming our lives around the pattern of Christ. And that was a great moment to change to the second slide. Thank you. There really is no place in the Christian life for behaviour that is abusive, deceitful, or dishonest. And Colossians is really clear that our old selves need to be kind of stripped away of anything that remains of those practices. And it gives us an invitation to put on new clothing. And our new clothing is to be renewed in knowledge, and it surely includes integrity and stability and accountability. These all need to be worked at, and they all bring freedom in Christ. Now, in whatever roles we have as clergy, as authorised ministers, of people with lay positions in the church, we have opportunities for transgressing all kinds of different boundaries. We might be on the receiving end of people's projections about who we are. We might be the object of people's desires. They might get us mixed up with the God who they've come to worship. And it's important that we can receive those projections safely, be present with people in their journeys of faith, but remain within really carefully managed boundaries. And it's important that we are open to reflecting on our own practice, to being challenged by others and being held to account. Because the true love that we know in God doesn't thrive in murky shadows. The true love that belongs to God is open and faithful and strong. It stands scrutiny, it bears the test of time, and it never preys on the weak. Now, St. Paul then goes on to speak about forgiving those who hurt us, but he doesn't say a whole lot about how we should seek forgiveness of the people we may have hurt, whether individually or because we're part of institutions like the church that haven't listened, haven't acted, and haven't changed their ways. But whatever we do with that kind of gap, I think it's really clear that we have to keep learning, that we have to teach each other, invite teaching for ourselves, and invite correction from each other so that we can grow in wisdom. And I think at an institutional level, that means things like apologising better to those who've been hurt. It means having better policy and training and good practice around safeguarding and resourcing it properly. It means responding generously and humbly to people who are survivors of abuse of all different kinds. It means a different kind of relationship with insurance companies so that the church acts with integrity and without being seen to drag its feet. So for me, at the heart of this passage in Colossians is this phrase about clothing ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. It's about repenting fully, asking God to renew our hearts and minds, and recognizing that that's an ongoing process. It's that learning mindset. It's the being renewed, being open to being transformed again and again and again by God, so that we can come to worship God, knowing that we are far from perfect, but knowing that God is working with us to renew us and to bring us into new life, and to better be able to reflect that love that we know is of God. If I could have slide 15, just for the last few minutes, I want to ask you to do an exercise yourselves. And just to be clear, I'm not going to ask you to share this with anybody or to give any feedback or put anything in the chat. But here's some questions over the next couple of minutes So let's say for the next 5 minutes, for you to perhaps jot down a few thoughts and to ask yourself, because this learning, it always starts with me, it starts with you, it starts with us. And then that's how you can start to transform a culture. So first, how are you personally held to account? If you've got pen and paper in front of you, you might want to start jotting a few things down as they come to mind. Who holds you to account? Who says, you know what, that's not okay? Or do you know how you came across? Who helps us keep ourselves in check? Second question is around being alert. How do you keep your eyes open to any broken boundaries in your own church or in your community settings? Some things just become normal because they're familiar, but are there things that you might want to look at with fresh eyes and think, you know what, I'm not happy about that, and I'm going to go and ask somebody? Third, is there a person or a group of people or a mentor or a confessor or a spiritual director who you can be really open with about things that tempt you or things that trouble you? And it's normal to be tempted and to be troubled by things. And it's good to be able to talk that over with somebody, to shine a light into it and to see where you can go to help you or other people head in a healthier direction. And then what can you do to contribute to a culture of healthy safeguarding in your own setting? Where can healthy conversations happen about safeguarding from abuse of all different kinds and about well-being? What can you do that makes a difference? And what do you want to do differently from now on? Is there one thing that you think, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to start doing this, or I'm going to have this conversation? Jot some thoughts down if you can. Just spend the time offering your own reflections before God. Perhaps if anything's spoken to you in the chapter from the passage from Colossians. In a couple of minutes, I'll stop talking now, so you've got some silence to think. I will come back to pray together. Thank you for doing that, and for your patience and your engagement and your questions during this evening. I hope that either from what I've said or despite what I've said, you've got some thoughts to take forward about what you'd like to reflect on further, what you'd like to learn more about, conversations or habits that you'd like to develop. If any of this has raised difficult things for you, I really would encourage you to go speak to a safe and trusted person, and remember that your diocesan safeguarding advisor is there if there are matters that you even just think might be safeguarding. I know that the slides will be sent to you afterwards. I think to anybody who wants them, I think they'll be sent round, and you're welcome to reflect on them and use them. There's also plenty of material on the Church of England website as well. If you follow some of those links, you can look at a bit more in a bit more detail. And they're going to be on the website as well. I can just see from Tim in the chat. So head off to the website and you'll be able to download them from there. nationaldeaneries.net. I'm going to invite us to pray together as a way of finishing as we draw towards 9 o'clock. So if I could just have slide 16 I know this is going to make a big noise and it won't be harmonious, but let's do it anyway. Could you take yourselves off mute? And I'd like to invite you to say this prayer with me, because although safeguarding and well-being has to start with our own learning, it's also got to be something that we do together in community. And church communities are glorious places. They're colourful and exciting, and places where we find God. And so let's together, as the community of the church, if you're able to, take yourselves off mute and let's pray together this prayer that's on slide 16. Pray together. Loving God, you know our deepest desires. Show us where we need to be healed. Open our eyes to see where your image is being wounded, and give us passion to defend the weak. Renew us in knowledge and form your church in the image of Christ. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Joanne, thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for super. You've really guided us through what's a very sensitive issue, and so we're really very grateful for all you've given us this evening. Your openness and genuineness has been really lovely. So thank you very much, and thank you very much indeed for joining us, everyone. I just want to say to us, our next session will be on the 18th of May. When we look forward to having Sam Hetherington, who's going to talk about social prescribing, and that will be coming out. Tim and Tug will be sending those things out to us again in the future. But we are really grateful for you all being with us this evening. And Bishop Joanne, a very great thanks to you for all you've given to us. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you.